The Hungry Shore, Chapter 1. The morning radio check had become as routine as coffee for Alex Winters. Every day at 0800 hours, the same sequence. Test the emergency beacon, confirm radio frequency clarity, log weather conditions, and check in with the harbor master at Port Beacon 12 miles south. 3 months into the lighthouse keeper job, Alex had the routine down to a precise 15-minute window. Beacon Point light to Port Beacon Harbor. Morning check. Over. Port Beacon Harbor, we copy. Beacon Point. Weather looks good today, Alex. How's that isolation treating you? Can't complain, Marina. Quiet morning, visibility about 8 miles. Seas calm. Forecast still showing that front moving in tonight. Affirmative. Should hit around 2100 hours. Nothing serious, just some fog and chop. Keep an eye on the shipping lanes. Might have some traffic seeking shelter. Alex signed off and made the standard notations in the logbook, the same precise entries that Great Uncle Thomas had apparently made for 37 years before his fatal heart attack last spring. The routine was comforting in its predictability, a sharp contrast to the chaos Alex had left behind in Seattle, the failed marketing firm, the equally failed marriage, the general sense that life had become a series of professional disappointments punctuated by expensive therapy sessions. The lighthouse keeper position had been a godsend, arriving via certified letter just when Alex was contemplating bankruptcy and wondering if moving back in with parents was the ultimate symbol of midlife failure. A distant relative Alex barely remembered, offering an escape that came with a cottage, a modest salary, and the kind of solitude that felt like luxury after years of open-plan offices and endless meetings. The work itself was surprisingly engaging. Modern lighthouse operations were largely automated, but someone still needed to maintain the equipment, monitor maritime traffic, and serve as the first point of contact for vessels in distress. Alex had enough sailing experience from college to handle the radio protocols and basic navigation, though the technical aspects of lighthouse optics and coastal weather patterns were still being learned through trial and error. This morning's equipment check revealed the same minor inconsistency Alex had been noticing for the past week. The lighthouse beam seemed to rotate about 15 degrees off its documented pattern. The maintenance manual showed the light sweeping a 180-degree arc from northeast to northwest, but Alex's compass reading suggested it was actually covering northeast to north-northwest. A subtle difference that probably didn't matter much, but the kind of detail that nagged at someone who was still learning the job. Alex made a note to call the Coast Guard maintenance office about recalibrating the rotation mechanism, then headed down to the cottage kitchen to start the coffee that had become the second most important part of the morning routine. The cottage sat about 50 yards from the lighthouse base, connected by a gravel path that Alex had learned to navigate without a flashlight even on the darkest nights. It was a simple 2-bedroom structure, built sometime in the 1940s but well-maintained and surprisingly cozy. Great Uncle Thomas had left it fully furnished, including a library of maritime books, weather instruments, and what appeared to be decades of carefully maintained logbooks. Those logbooks had become Alex's main source of entertainment during the long evenings. Thomas had been meticulous in his record-keeping, documenting everything from routine maintenance to dramatic storm responses. Reading through the entries was like watching a career unfold in real time, from Thomas's early days learning the job in the 1980s to his final entries just days before his death. But as Alex flipped through the most recent volumes over morning coffee, something about the entries began to feel off. Not obviously wrong, but subtly inconsistent in ways that were hard to pin down. For instance, Thomas had logged 17 ship distress calls over the past year, all handled successfully according to his notes. But when Alex had mentioned this to Marina at Port Beacon Harbor, she'd seemed surprised by the number. 17? That's more than we usually see in the whole Southern District. Thomas was always efficient with emergency response, but I don't remember hearing about that many incidents. Alex had assumed Marina was just busy and hadn't paid attention to every rescue coordination. But cross-referencing the dates with Coast Guard bulletins available online, Alex could only find official records for 9 of the 17 incidents Thomas had logged. The other 8 had no corresponding reports, no follow-up documentation, no evidence they'd ever been reported to maritime authorities. It was probably just a bureaucratic oversight, Thomas logging calls that turned out to be false alarms or situations that resolved before official assistance was needed. But the pattern was odd enough to be noticeable, and Alex was beginning to develop the uncomfortable feeling that there were aspects of the lighthouse keeper position that hadn't been fully explained. This feeling intensified when Alex discovered the basement storage room. The cottage had a small cellar that Alex had initially assumed was just for utilities and supplies. But while searching for spare parts for the radio equipment, Alex had found a locked room that wasn't mentioned in any of the property documentation. The key was on Thomas's key ring, labeled simply Archive. The room contained what appeared to be decades of additional logbooks, dating back to the 1940s, along with charts, photographs, and correspondence that suggested lighthouse keepers had been maintaining much more extensive records than the standard Coast Guard requirements would necessitate. Most intriguing were the detailed ocean charts, hand-annotated with notations in different handwriting styles that must have represented multiple keepers over the years. The charts showed the waters around Beacon Point in far more detail than anything Alex had seen, including depth measurements, current patterns, and what appeared to be seasonal migration routes for various marine life. But it was the shipping incident maps that really caught Alex's attention. Someone had been tracking vessel losses and distress calls in the Beacon Point area for over 60 years, using different colored pins to mark different types of incidents. Red pins for confirmed sinkings, yellow for missing vessels, blue for successful rescues, and white for what the legend described as unconfirmed incidents. There were a lot of white pins. Alex spread the largest chart on the cottage's kitchen table and counted the markings. In the past decade alone, there were 23 white pins in the waters within 5 miles of Beacon Point Light. 23 unconfirmed incidents that weren't reflected in any official maritime records. Either previous lighthouse keepers had been incredibly paranoid about documenting things that hadn't actually happened, or there was significantly more maritime activity and more maritime trouble in this area than anyone was willing to officially acknowledge. Alex made a mental note to ask Marina about the historical shipping patterns when they talked tomorrow. In the meantime, there was routine maintenance to finish before the evening's predicted weather front arrived. The lighthouse beacon required daily inspection, and Alex had developed a comfortable routine of checking the light assembly during the afternoon when the sun provided good visibility for maintenance work. The mechanism was remarkably complex for something that essentially just rotated a powerful beam of light, with multiple backup systems and precision timing controls that ensured the beam swept its assigned pattern with clockwork accuracy. Today, Alex brought along a compass to double-check the rotation pattern that had been nagging at attention all week. The maintenance documentation clearly specified a 180-degree sweep from 045 degrees northeast to 225 degrees southwest. But as Alex watched the beam rotate through its cycle, the compass readings confirmed what had been suspected. The light was actually covering 045 degrees northeast to 315 degrees northwest. That was a 45-degree error, significant enough to potentially misdirect ships rather than guide them safely. Alex spent 20 minutes trying to locate the calibration controls, but the adjustment mechanisms were more complex than anything covered in the basic training materials. This would definitely require a call to the Coast Guard maintenance office, probably a visit from a qualified technician. But as Alex prepared to climb down from the light assembly, something on the horizon caught attention. A fishing boat, maybe 3 miles out, moving slowly through the waters that were marked with several white pins on the basement chart. Alex pulled out the binoculars that hung by the maintenance platform and focused on the vessel. It was the Sarah's Dream, a boat Alex had seen several times over the past few months. Usually it stayed closer to shore, working the waters near Port Beacon. But today it was heading directly toward the area that the historical charts suggested was particularly prone to unconfirmed incidents. Alex watched for several minutes as the boat continued on its course, then disappeared behind a small island that blocked the view from the lighthouse. When it emerged on the far side of the island 10 minutes later, Alex raised the binoculars again. The Sarah's Dream was gone. Alex swept the visible ocean with the binoculars, searching for any sign of the fishing boat. Nothing. No vessel, no debris, no indication that a boat had been in those waters just minutes before. Alex checked the radio immediately. No distress calls, no emergency transmissions, nothing to suggest a vessel in trouble. The waters appeared calm, with no weather conditions that would cause sudden problems for an experienced fishing crew. But the Sarah's Dream had definitely vanished. Alex made a careful entry in the logbook. 1,547 hours. Observed fishing vessel Sarah's Dream, approximately 3 miles northeast. Last seen heading toward Seal Rock area. Lost visual contact 1,552 hours. No radio contact established. Weather conditions normal, seas calm. It was probably nothing. Fishing boats changed course all the time, and there were plenty of ways a vessel could move out of sight line from the lighthouse without anything being wrong. But as Alex climbed down from the beacon platform and headed back to the cottage, the uncomfortable feeling returned. The sense that important things were happening in the waters around Beacon Point Light, and that understanding those things was going to require much more than routine maintenance and radio checks. That evening, as the predicted weather front brought fog rolling in from the north, Alex sat in the cottage kitchen with Thomas's logbooks and the basement charts spread across the table. The beacon light swept its steady, slightly misdirected pattern outside, and Alex began the careful work of cross-referencing historical incidents with official maritime records. By midnight, the pattern was undeniable. Ships disappeared near Beacon Point Light with disturbing regularity, and had been doing so for decades. Most of these disappearances were never officially reported, never investigated, never explained. And for the past 60 years, lighthouse keepers had been carefully documenting every incident, creating a secret archive of maritime disasters that no one else seemed to acknowledge. Alex was beginning to understand that the lighthouse keeper position involved responsibilities that went far beyond maintaining equipment and monitoring radio frequencies. But understanding exactly what those responsibilities were, and why they'd been kept secret, was going to require answers that weren't contained in any manual or logbook. Outside, the fog grew thicker, and the lighthouse beam continued its steady, misdirected sweep across waters that had claimed far too many vessels over the years. Tomorrow, Alex decided, there would need to be some very specific questions asked of some very specific people. Chapter 2. Alex spent the sleepless night creating a comprehensive database of the discrepancies between Thomas's logs and official Coast Guard records. By dawn, the pattern was even more disturbing than initially suspected. In the past 5 years alone, Thomas had logged 32 maritime incidents near Beacon Point, but only 14 had corresponding official reports. 18 missing reports. 18 situations where vessels had apparently needed assistance, but no record existed of Coast Guard response, successful rescue, or lost documentation. The morning radio check with Marina took on new significance. Port Beacon Harbor to Beacon Point. Morning check. Over. Beacon Point to Port Beacon. Good morning, Marina. Question for you. Do you have records of the Sarah's Dream checking in yesterday evening? I lost visual contact around 1,600 hours. A pause that lasted longer than usual radio protocol. The Sarah's Dream? Alex, that boat was lost 2 years ago. Went down in a storm off Gull Point. Alex's coffee went cold. I'm sorry, what? Captain Dave Morrison and his crew. 3 men lost. We had a memorial service. Alex, are you feeling all right? You sound confused. No, I'm sure I saw that boat yesterday. I have it logged. 3 miles northeast, heading toward Seal Rock. Another long pause. Alex, I think you might want to come into town today. Maybe you've been spending too much time alone out there. After signing off, Alex immediately pulled up maritime registration databases on the laptop. Sarah's Dream, registration BC 4471, was indeed listed as total loss storm damage, October 15, 2021. The accident report described a sudden squall that had caught the fishing vessel in open water, with no survivors recovered. But Alex had definitely seen a boat yesterday, had watched it through binoculars, noted its course and direction, observed it disappear behind Seal Rock Island. Either Alex was having some kind of psychological break, which was possible given the stress and isolation, or something very strange was happening in the waters around Beacon Point Light. The basement archive took on new urgency. Alex spent the morning pulling every chart and logbook, looking for references to vessels that had been officially lost, but continued to appear in lighthouse keeper records. The pattern was there, hidden in decades of careful documentation. Ships that had been declared lost would continue to show up in the logbooks for months or even years afterward, sighted in the waters near the lighthouse, following courses that inevitably led toward the areas marked with white pins on the incident maps. Thomas's predecessor, a keeper named Harold Voss, had been particularly detailed in his observations. His entries from the 1990s included sketches of vessels he'd observed, along with notes that became increasingly concerned over time. March 15, 1994, observed MV Clearwater again today, same course as previous sightings. Ship was reported lost January 1993. Crew continues to appear unaware of radio contact attempts. June 8, 1994, Clearwater sighting confirmed. Vessel appears to be in good condition. No signs of damage consistent with reported loss. Unable to establish communication. September 22, 1994, Clearwater approached within 1 mile of lighthouse. Crew visible on deck, following normal fishing operations. Ship responded to light signals with appropriate maritime courtesy. No indication crew aware of their reported status. November 30, 1994, last sighting of Clearwater. Vessel followed standard course toward Seal Rock area. Lost visual contact as usual. Note: this marks 18 months since official loss report. Pattern consistent with other long-term observations. Alex stared at Harold's sketches of the Clearwater. The detail was remarkable. Individual crew members drawn with enough precision to be recognizable. Rigging and equipment rendered with the accuracy of someone who understood fishing operations. These weren't hallucinations or psychological episodes. The lighthouse keepers had been observing something real. Something that official maritime authorities either couldn't see or chose not to acknowledge. The phone rang, interrupting the research. Marina's voice sounded concerned. "Alex, I've been thinking about our conversation this morning. I called Doc Peterson in town. He's the one who handled the health clearance for your keeper certification. He'd like you to come in for a checkup, just to make sure the isolation isn't affecting your perception." "Marina, I know what I saw. I have detailed notes, compass bearings, time observations. I'm sure you do. But honey, that boat has been on the bottom of the ocean for 2 years. 3 families are still grieving those men. Maybe the stress of the job is..." Alex hung up and immediately called the Coast Guard station at Port Haven, 30 miles north. The duty officer was professional but clearly skeptical when Alex described the Sarah's Dream sighting. "Sir, we have that vessel listed as a total loss from 2021. Are you certain about your identification? Fishing boats can look similar from a distance. I've seen the Sarah's Dream multiple times over the past 3 months. I know what it looks like." "Multiple times? Sir, I'm going to need you to file a formal report if you're claiming to have observed a vessel that's been officially declared lost." Alex spent the afternoon preparing a comprehensive report. Dates, times, compass bearings, weather conditions, and detailed descriptions of every anomalous vessel sighting since taking the lighthouse keeper position. The report ran to 12 pages and included copies of Harold Voss's sketches and documentation. But before submitting it, Alex decided to make one more check of the basement archives. Something had been nagging at attention. A detail that seemed important but hadn't been fully processed. The basement storage room was larger than initially realized. Behind the shelves of logbooks and charts, there was another door, also locked, with a key labeled Private Files on Thomas's ring. The second room contained correspondence. Decades of letters between lighthouse keepers and various maritime officials, documenting increasingly frustrated attempts to get official recognition of the anomalous vessel sightings. The earliest letters dated to the 1950s, when the lighthouse was first established with civilian keepers rather than Coast Guard personnel. Each keeper had apparently tried to report the strange phenomena through official channels, and each had been systematically dismissed or ignored. But it was a letter from 1987 that made Alex's hands shake while reading. "Dear Harold, your report regarding anomalous vessel sightings has been reviewed by our technical committee. While we appreciate your diligence in maintaining detailed observations, we must advise that these phenomena are not considered suitable for inclusion in official maritime safety documentation. The vessels you have observed are indeed present in your operational area. However, Their nature and purpose fall under the jurisdiction of specialized maritime authorities that operate independently of standard Coast Guard protocol. Please continue to maintain your detailed logs, as this documentation serves important purposes that cannot be discussed in standard correspondence. Your observations are valuable and necessary, but should not be reported through normal channels. Under no circumstances should you attempt to establish direct contact with the observed vessels or interfere with their operations. The safety of your position and the continued operation of Beacon Point Light depend on strict adherence to observation-only protocols. We recognize that this situation places unusual demands on lighthouse personnel, and we deeply appreciate the discretion and professionalism that lighthouse keepers have shown in managing these responsibilities. If you have specific concerns about your safety or the operational requirements of your position, please contact the emergency coordination number provided in your sealed instructions. Respectfully, Captain Margaret Torres, Maritime Special Operations. Alex read the letter 3 times before the implications fully sank in. The Coast Guard knew about the anomalous vessels. They had known for decades. The lighthouse keepers weren't going crazy or experiencing isolation-induced hallucinations. They were documenting something real, something that official authorities acknowledged but refused to discuss publicly. But what were sealed instructions? And where were they? A systematic search of both basement rooms eventually yielded a manila envelope, unmarked but sealed with wax, hidden behind a loose board in the archive room wall. Thomas's initials were pressed into the wax seal. Inside, typed on letterhead that bore no identifying information, were 3 pages of instructions that answered some questions while raising dozens more. Beacon Point Light, Operational Protocol. Confidential, Lighthouse Keeper only. The lighthouse keeper position at Beacon Point Light includes responsibilities beyond standard maritime safety operations. The following protocols are mandatory and must be followed precisely. 1. Maintain detailed logs of all anomalous vessel sightings, including date, time, weather conditions, vessel description, and observed course. 2. Do not attempt radio contact with observed vessels. Do not respond to any radio transmissions that may originate from observed vessels. 3. Ensure lighthouse beam maintains specified rotation pattern. Regular calibration is essential. Beam must sweep waters northeast of lighthouse position during peak activity periods, midnight to 0400 hours. 4. Report equipment malfunctions to emergency coordination number, only 978-555-0147. Do not request service through standard Coast Guard maintenance channels. 5. In case of direct approach by observed vessels, within 500 yards of lighthouse, immediately activate emergency beacon sequence, 3 long, 2 short, 3 long, and contact emergency coordination. 6. Under no circumstances should you leave lighthouse grounds between sunset and sunrise during new moon periods. Maintain visual observation of surrounding waters throughout these periods. 7. If approached by local authorities, maritime officials, or civilian personnel regarding anomalous observations, refer them to emergency coordination number. Provide no details of observations or special protocols. 8. These instructions and all related documentation must be secured against unauthorized access. Upon termination of lighthouse keeper position, all materials must be transferred to replacement keeper or returned to emergency coordination. Failure to follow these protocols may result in termination of position and/or significant safety risks to lighthouse personnel and surrounding communities. Alex stared at the document for a long time, trying to process what it meant. The lighthouse keeper position wasn't just about maintaining a beacon. It was about monitoring something that required official secrecy and specialized protocols. The beam calibration suddenly made sense. The lighthouse wasn't misdirected by accident. It was deliberately modified to sweep specific waters during certain times. But why? And what exactly were the lighthouse keepers observing that required such elaborate secrecy? Outside, afternoon was turning to evening, and the automated beacon was preparing for another night of operation. According to the sealed instructions, Alex should be maintaining visual observation of the surrounding waters, especially during the new moon periods. Alex checked the lunar calendar. Tonight would be the new moon, Whatever the lighthouse keepers had been documenting for the past 70 years, tonight Alex was going to get a much closer look at it. The emergency coordination number could wait until morning. First, Alex needed to understand exactly what was happening in the waters around Beacon Point Light, and why that understanding required such extraordinary secrecy. The lighthouse beam began its steady sweep across the darkening ocean, and Alex settled into the beacon platform with binoculars, logbook, and a growing certainty that the night was going to provide answers to questions that had been accumulating for months. But as the first stars appeared and the beam continued its precise, deliberate pattern across waters that had claimed so many vessels over the years, Alex began to suspect that some answers were more dangerous than the questions they resolved. Chapter 3. The new moon night was darker than Alex had experienced since taking the lighthouse keeper position. Without lunar illumination, the ocean beyond the beacon's reach disappeared into absolute blackness, broken only by the occasional running lights of distant vessels following the main shipping lanes miles to the south. Alex had positioned in the lighthouse platform with the archive charts, a thermos of coffee, and the binoculars that had become essential equipment. According to the sealed instructions, the period between midnight and 0400 hours was when the lighthouse beam's modified pattern served its most critical function, whatever that function might be. The first anomaly appeared at 11:47 p.m. A fishing vessel emerged from the darkness northwest of the lighthouse, moving slowly but steadily toward the waters marked with white pins on the basement charts. Even in the poor visibility, Alex could make out enough detail to identify it as a typical New England fishing boat, probably 40 to 50 feet, with the distinctive profile of a vessel designed for offshore work. Alex focused the binoculars and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. The boat was the Sarah's Dream. The vessel moved through the water with normal fishing boat behavior. Steady speed, purposeful course, navigation lights properly displayed. But something about its appearance was wrong in a way that Alex couldn't initially identify. The boat looked exactly as it had during the daylight sighting, but there was a quality to its presence that seemed muted somehow, as if it were being observed through a filter that dulled certain aspects of reality. Alex made careful notes in the logbook. 2,347 hours, vessel matching profile of Sarah's Dream, observed bearing 315 degrees. Distance approximately 2 miles. Course southeast toward Seal Rock area. Visibility poor. Observation limited to navigation lights and general profile. As the Sarah's Dream continued its course, Alex became aware of other movement on the horizon. More vessels were appearing from various directions, all converging on the same general area northeast of the lighthouse. Within 20 minutes, Alex counted 7 different boats, all moving with the same purposeful but slightly unreal quality. And then the lighthouse beam swept across the water where the vessels were gathering, and Alex saw something that made rational thought temporarily impossible. The boats weren't alone. Something vast and dark was moving beneath them. Not a whale or any marine life Alex could identify, but something that seemed to extend far beyond the visible range of even the powerful lighthouse beam. When the light passed over the area, Alex caught glimpses of what appeared to be tentacles or massive appendages reaching up from the depths, but they vanished so quickly that it was difficult to be certain of what had been observed. Alex grabbed the emergency coordination number from the sealed instructions, then hesitated. The protocols were clear about maintaining observation, but they also emphasized not interfering with whatever was happening in those waters. A decision to continue watching rather than calling immediately. Over the next hour, Alex documented the most extraordinary and terrifying maritime phenomenon imaginable. The fishing boats, at least a dozen of them now, including several that Alex recognized from previous impossible sightings, had formed a loose circle around something in the water that defied description. When the lighthouse beam swept across the area, brief glimpses revealed the truth that decades of lighthouse keepers had been documenting. The vessels weren't being destroyed by whatever was in the water. They were feeding it. Each boat would move to the edge of the circle, and something would emerge from the depths. Massive tentacles or appendages that dwarfed the fishing vessels. But instead of crushing or destroying the boats, the creature seemed to interact with them. Alex watched through the binoculars as crew members moved about the decks in what appeared to be normal fishing operations, but they were throwing things overboard that definitely weren't fish. The lighthouse beam's timing wasn't accidental. Every 12 minutes, when the beacon swept across the feeding area, it provided just enough illumination for the lighthouse keeper to document what was happening, but not enough sustained light to fully reveal the creature that was being served by the phantom fleet. Alex's hands were shaking as detailed notes went into the logbook. 0130 hours, multiple vessels, 12 to 15 confirmed, participating in coordinated activity with large marine entity. Entity characteristics: extremely large, tentacled, appears to be receiving materials from vessel crews. Vessels include previously documented lost fishing boats. Crew behavior suggests normal operational awareness despite official status of vessels. At 0200 hours, the pattern changed. A new vessel appeared on the horizon, larger than the fishing boats, with the distinctive profile of a Coast Guard cutter. Alex focused the binoculars with growing alarm as the official vessel moved directly toward the feeding area. This wasn't one of the phantom boats. The Coast Guard cutter was solid, real, with the crisp radio transmissions and proper navigation protocols that Alex had learned to associate with legitimate maritime operations. And it was heading directly into the waters where something vast and hungry was being fed by a fleet of officially non-existent vessels. Alex grabbed the radio immediately. Coast Guard cutter approaching Seal Rock area. This is beacon point light with emergency navigation warning. Over. The response was professional and immediate. Beacon point light, this is Coast Guard cutter Vigilant. We copy your transmission. Over. Vigilant, be advised you are approaching waters with significant hazards. Recommend immediate course change to avoid area northeast of your current position. Beacon point, we show clear water on all charts. Can you specify the nature of the hazard? Alex stared at the binoculars, watching the Coast Guard vessel continue its approach toward waters where a dozen phantom fishing boats were feeding something that appeared large enough to sink a battleship. How could the official Coast Guard charts not show hazards in an area that had been claiming vessels for decades? Vigilant. I'm observing multiple vessels in your path. Possible collision hazard. A longer pause. Beacon point, our radar shows no contacts in that area. Are you certain about your observations? Through the binoculars, Alex watched the impossible happen. The Coast Guard cutter passed directly through the area where the phantom fishing fleet was operating, and neither seemed to be aware of the other's presence. The Real Coast Guard vessel continued on its course, its crew apparently unable to see the feeding that was happening around them. The phantom boats continued their operations, equally unaware of the official vessel that had passed through their midst. Alex was witnessing two different versions of the same waters, occupying the same physical space but somehow separate from each other. The lighthouse beam was the only connection between them, providing glimpses of the phantom activity while the real world remained unaware of what was happening in the darkness. The sealed instructions suddenly made terrible sense. The lighthouse keepers weren't just observing anomalous vessel activity. They were monitoring a parallel maritime reality, one where ships that had been lost to something ancient and hungry continued to serve their destroyer in an endless cycle of feeding. At 0300 hours, Alex made the call to the emergency coordination number. The phone was answered on the first ring by a voice that sounded like it had been waiting for the call. Coordination. Keeper identification. This is Alex Winters, Beacon Point Light. I'm observing the feeding. Confirmed. First direct observation. Yes, I need to understand what I'm seeing. Maintain your position. Specialist en route. Do not attempt to interfere with operations. Do not use radio to communicate with observed vessels. Document everything, but take no action beyond observation. What is that thing in the water? A pause. Something that has been there much longer than the lighthouse, Mr. Winters. Something that requires careful management to prevent it from expanding its operations beyond the designated area. Management? You mean this is controlled? The lighthouse serves as more than a navigation aid, Mr. Winters. It serves as a containment beacon. The beam pattern keeps the entity's feeding activities within acceptable boundaries. Without that pattern, it would expand its territory indefinitely. Alex felt the world shift beneath understanding. The fishing boats, They're not really lost, are they? They're lost to our reality, yes, but they continue to exist in the entity's domain, serving its needs. Think of it as supernatural conscription. The entity requires regular feeding to remain satisfied with its current territory. The lost vessels provide that feeding. And if the feeding stops, then it seeks new sources. It expands into areas with living crews, real vessels, populated coastlines. The Phantom Fleet is a sacrifice that prevents much greater losses. Alex stared out at the water where the feeding continued, understanding finally dawning. The lighthouse wasn't protecting ships from danger. It was maintaining a supernatural arrangement that kept an ancient predator satisfied with phantom prey, so it wouldn't hunt living victims. How long has this been going on? The entity has existed in those waters for centuries. The lighthouse was built specifically to manage its activities after it began expanding its territory in the 1940s. Every lighthouse keeper learns to maintain the balance. What happens if I refuse to continue this management? The voice on the phone became colder. Then you become part of the Phantom Fleet, Mr. Winters, and we send someone else to take your place. At 0400 hours, the feeding ended. The phantom vessels dispersed into the darkness as efficiently as they had appeared, and the massive presence beneath the water settled back into the depths. The lighthouse beam continued its steady sweep, but now Alex understood its true purpose, not to guide vessels to safety, but to contain something that would consume the entire coast if given the opportunity. A boat appeared on the horizon, moving toward the lighthouse dock with running lights that marked it as very much real. The specialist was arriving to explain Alex's new reality, that the lighthouse keeper position wasn't just about maintaining equipment, but about managing the most dangerous maritime secret on the eastern seaboard. As dawn approached, Alex sat in the lighthouse platform with the night's logbook entries and the growing realization that there would be no escape from this responsibility. The entity in the water was contained, but only through the constant vigilance and cooperation of people who agreed to sacrifice their normal lives to prevent catastrophic expansion of its feeding territory. The lighthouse beam continued its sweep, and Alex began to understand why previous keepers had been so meticulous in their documentation. They weren't just recording anomalous phenomena. They were maintaining the operational records for humanity's most critical supernatural containment protocol. And now Alex was part of that protocol, whether by choice or circumstance. Chapter 4. The specialist arrived at dawn in a Coast Guard auxiliary vessel that looked official but carried no identifying markings. The woman who tied up at the lighthouse dock appeared to be in her 50s, with gray hair and the weather-beaten complexion of someone who had spent decades working on the water. She introduced herself simply as Captain Torres. "Margaret Torres," she said, shaking Alex's hand with a grip that suggested considerable physical strength. "I've been managing maritime special operations in this sector for 23 years. I believe you have questions." They sat in the cottage kitchen with coffee and Alex's logbook from the previous night spread across the table. Captain Torres reviewed the entries with the professional attention of someone evaluating a technical report. "Very thorough documentation," she said finally. "Thomas trained you well, even posthumously. Thomas never told me anything about this. I found the sealed instructions by accident. Thomas died of a heart attack brought on by 37 years of stress from managing this containment," Torres replied. "We don't usually provide full briefings until keepers have demonstrated they can handle the psychological pressure. Most people who learn about the entity too quickly either quit immediately or suffer mental breakdowns." Alex studied Torres's face, looking for signs that this was an elaborate hoax or psychological test. "You're saying there's really a sea monster that feeds on ghost ships, and lighthouse keepers have been covering it up for 70 years? I'm saying there's an ancient marine entity that exists partially outside normal reality, and that entity has been contained in this area through careful management of its feeding requirements. The ghost ships are vessels that have been absorbed into its domain but continue to serve its needs. The lighthouse beam maintains the boundaries of that domain." Torres pulled out a tablet and showed Alex satellite imagery of the New England coast. Red zones marked several areas where similar operations were apparently being conducted. "There are 7 active containment sites along the eastern seaboard," she explained. "Each one manages a different type of entity, but they all require human cooperation to prevent expansion into populated areas. Beacon Point is unique because the entity here is both the largest and the most potentially catastrophic if containment fails. What makes it so dangerous? Size, intelligence, and feeding requirements. Most of the entities we manage are relatively small. They can be satisfied with occasional vessels or controlled populations of marine life. The Beacon Point entity is different. It's ancient, possibly dating back to pre-Columbian times, and it's been growing stronger over the centuries. Torres opened a thick folder containing historical documents and photographs. Native American tribes in this area have legends about something they called the Deep Hunger, a spirit that lived in the ocean and demanded tribute of boats and crews. Early European settlers reported similar phenomena, but they assumed it was just dangerous waters. Alex looked through photographs dating back to the 1940s, images of vessels being constructed, lighthouse modifications being made, and meetings between people in military uniforms and civilian clothes. After World War II, maritime traffic increased dramatically along this coast, Torres continued. The entity began expanding its territory, probably responding to the increased presence of potential prey. By 1949, it was actively hunting vessels as far south as Cape Cod and as far north as Bar Harbor. So you built the lighthouse to stop it? We built the lighthouse to redirect it. The entity responds to specific electromagnetic frequencies generated by the beacon pattern. Those frequencies create boundaries that it instinctively respects, probably because they simulate some kind of natural territorial marker. Torres showed Alex technical diagrams of the lighthouse's modified beacon system. The light pattern serves two functions. It contains the entity within acceptable territorial boundaries, and it maintains what we call a feeding schedule. The phantom vessels appear on schedule and provide regular sustenance, so the entity doesn't need to hunt actively. But where do the phantom vessels come from? That's the part we don't fully understand. The entity seems to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. When it destroys a vessel in our reality, that vessel continues to exist in the entity's domain. The crews appear to maintain their normal consciousness and behavior, but they're compelled to serve the entity's feeding requirements. Alex thought about the careful way the phantom fishing boats had moved during the night's observation. They don't know they're dead, do they? We believe they experience their existence as continuing normal operations. From their perspective, they're still fishing, still following their regular routes, still caring for their vessels and crews. The entity preserves their consciousness as part of the feeding process. The implications were horrifying. How many crews are trapped in that domain? We estimate over 300 vessels and approximately 800 crew members accumulated over the past century. The entity feeds not just on the physical destruction of vessels, but on the ongoing service of the absorbed crews. Torres closed the folder and looked directly at Alex. The lighthouse keeper's job is to maintain the containment that keeps those 300 phantom vessels satisfied with their current role, so the entity doesn't need to claim new victims. You're not just observing supernatural phenomena. You're managing the most complex maritime containment operation on the planet. Alex stood up and walked to the kitchen window, staring out at the ocean that looked deceptively normal in the morning sunlight. What happens if I refuse to continue this? The entity would interpret the discontinuation of the lighthouse beacon as a territorial challenge. It would begin expanding its hunting range immediately. Within 6 months, it would be actively destroying vessels throughout the Gulf of Maine. Within 2 years, commercial shipping along the entire eastern seaboard would become impossible. And you'd replace me with another keeper, if necessary. But we prefer cooperative keepers. The job is difficult enough without unwilling participation. Alex turned back to Torres. What about evacuation? Couldn't you just warn ships away from the area? The entity's territory would expand to encompass any area it could reach. Maritime exclusion zones would need to extend over 1,200 square miles of some of the most important shipping waters on the East Coast. The economic impact would be catastrophic. Torres stood and began packing her materials. Mr. Winters, I know this is overwhelming. Most keepers take several months to fully accept their situation. But I need you to understand that you're not being asked to sacrifice your life. You're being asked to manage a situation that protects millions of other lives. What kind of life is it, though? Isolated on a lighthouse, watching phantom ships feed a sea monster, knowing I can never tell anyone the truth about what I'm doing. It's the life Thomas chose for 37 years. It's the life Harold Voss chose before him and Martin Cruz before him. Each one understood that some responsibilities are too important to abandon, regardless of personal cost. Torres handed Alex a new folder, much thicker than the previous one. This contains complete operational protocols, emergency procedures, and contact information for the support network you'll need to do this job effectively. You're not as alone as you think. After Torres left, Alex spent the morning reading through the comprehensive documentation of the lighthouse keeper's actual responsibilities. The protocols were extensive and precise, covering everything from routine beacon maintenance to emergency procedures for containment failure. But it was the section on keeper psychological support that provided the most important revelation. There was an entire network of people involved in maritime special operations, including other lighthouse keepers, Coast Guard personnel, marine researchers, and government officials who were aware of and actively managing supernatural maritime phenomena. Alex wasn't the only person living with impossible secrets. The phone rang at noon. Marina's voice sounded concerned but professional. Alex, I wanted to apologize for yesterday. Captain Torres explained that you're dealing with some specialized Coast Guard training requirements that I wasn't aware of. I hope you understand that I was just worried about you being out there alone. Marina, how long have you known about the special operations? About 15 years. Port Beacon Harbor serves as a coordination point for several containment sites. We handle communications, supply logistics, and personnel transport for the lighthouse keepers and other specialists. Alex felt a mixture of relief and betrayal. You knew what I was getting into when I took this position? We knew you'd learn gradually, the way all keepers do. The inheritance was arranged specifically to find someone who could handle the isolation and responsibility. Your great-uncle Thomas recommended you based on your psychological profile and maritime experience. Thomas knew me well enough to make that recommendation. Thomas knew your family history, your recent life challenges, and your need for a meaningful but private way to rebuild your life. He believed the lighthouse keeper position would provide exactly what you needed. That afternoon, Alex walked the lighthouse grounds with new understanding. The position hadn't been coincidental inheritance. It had been a carefully arranged recruitment into humanity's most secret and essential maritime operation. But as Alex climbed to the lighthouse platform and looked out over waters that contained centuries of phantom vessels and something ancient that fed on their eternal service, the isolation didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like the most important job on the eastern seaboard. The lighthouse beam would sweep its containment pattern again tonight, and Alex would be there to maintain the observations that kept an unimaginable horror satisfied with phantom prey instead of living victims. It wasn't the life Alex had planned, but it was the life that 300 absorbed crews and millions of innocent travelers depended on. And that, Alex realized, made it a life worth living. Chapter 5. 3 weeks into understanding the true nature of the lighthouse keeper position, Alex had developed new routines that incorporated both the official responsibilities and the supernatural containment protocols. The nights of new moon and dark skies had become opportunities to study the Phantom Fleet's operations in detail, building on decades of documentation left by previous keepers. The feeding patterns were more complex than initially apparent. The entity didn't simply consume random materials brought by the ghost ships. It seemed to require specific types of offerings delivered on precise schedules. The Phantom crews were following maritime routines that had apparently been refined over decades to maximize the entity's satisfaction while minimizing its need to seek additional prey. Alex had begun to recognize individual vessels and their specialized roles within the feeding operation. The Sarah's Dream appeared to serve as a coordinator, arriving first to establish the feeding pattern for each session. The Mary Catherine, a vessel that had officially been lost in 1998, brought what appeared to be processed fish products. The Northern Star delivered materials that Alex couldn't identify, but that produced distinctive phosphorescent reactions when they hit the water. Most intriguing was the Cassandra, a fishing boat that had disappeared in 1987 but now served what appeared to be a reconnaissance function, patrolling the boundaries of the entity's territory and reporting back to the main feeding group through methods Alex couldn't observe. The documentation routine had become almost meditative. Alex would position in the lighthouse platform with binoculars, charts, and detailed logbooks, recording every aspect of the Phantom Fleet's operations. The information wasn't just for historical record. Captain Torres had explained that understanding changes in the entity's behavior was crucial for maintaining effective containment. "The entity is intelligent," she had said during one of her monthly check-ins. "It learns, adapts, and occasionally tests the boundaries we've established. If its behavior patterns change significantly, that could indicate it's preparing to expand its territory." Tonight was different, though. As Alex settled into the observation routine, something about the Phantom Fleet's behavior immediately seemed wrong. The vessels appeared on schedule, but instead of forming their usual feeding circle northeast of the lighthouse, they were gathering in waters much closer to shore, within half a mile of the lighthouse itself. This was far outside their normal operational area and potentially indicated a territorial expansion that could threaten the containment. Alex immediately called the emergency coordination number. "Torres here. What's your status?" "The Phantom Fleet is operating much closer to shore than usual. They're within the inner boundary zone." A pause that lasted longer than Alex expected. "How many vessels?" Alex counted through the binoculars. 15 confirmed, possibly more arriving. "They're, Captain Torres, they're not feeding the entity. They're surrounding the lighthouse. I need you to activate the emergency beacon sequence immediately. 3 long, 2 short, 3 long. Then maintain continuous operation." Alex climbed to the beacon controls and activated the emergency pattern. The lighthouse beam began flashing the distress sequence while maintaining its regular sweep pattern. "Emergency beacon activated. What should I expect?" "The entity may be testing the containment boundaries. If the Phantom Fleet approaches closer than 300 yards, you need to evacuate to the mainland immediately. Do you have the emergency boat prepared?" Alex looked down at the small motorboat tied to the lighthouse dock, the evacuation vessel that had been maintained but never explained until now. "Yes, it's ready. But Captain Torres, if I evacuate, what happens to the containment?" "We have backup protocols. But Alex, under no circumstances should you attempt to communicate with the Phantom vessels if they approach the lighthouse directly. The entity may be using them to test your psychological response to containment pressure." Through the binoculars, Alex watched the Phantom Fleet complete its circle around the lighthouse. The vessels were now close enough that individual crew members were visible on deck, and they appeared to be engaged in normal fishing operations despite the unusual positioning. But something about their behavior was wrong in a way that Alex couldn't initially identify. The crews were moving through their tasks with mechanical precision, but they seemed to be performing their activities in reverse, bringing equipment up from holds instead of lowering it, pulling nets out of the water that appeared to be empty, operating deck machinery in sequences that made no operational sense. "Captain Torres, the Phantom crews are... they're performing their operations backwards." A sharp intake of breath from the phone. "Backwards how?" "They're going through fishing routines in reverse sequence as if they're undoing previous activities instead of performing new ones." "Alex, I need you to listen very carefully. What you're observing may indicate that the entity is attempting to reverse the feeding process, to return absorbed vessels to active reality rather than maintaining them in the Phantom domain." The implications hit Alex immediately. "You mean they might become real again?" "It's possible. But if that happens, the entity would lose its primary food source and would immediately begin seeking replacement prey from active shipping. You could be looking at the prelude to containment failure on a massive scale." Alex watched the Phantom Fleet with growing alarm. If the vessels returned to reality, they would carry crews who had been officially dead for decades, in boats that had been declared total losses. The revelation of their existence would expose the entire containment operation and possibly trigger panic that would make maritime traffic impossible to maintain. But worse, it would mean the entity was no longer satisfied with phantom prey and was preparing to resume active hunting. "What are my instructions?" "Maintain observation and documentation. If any phantom vessel approaches within 100 yards of the lighthouse, evacuate immediately. I'm en route with a response team. At 0200 hours, the behavior of the Phantom Fleet changed again. Instead of continuing their reverse operations, the vessels began moving in a complex pattern around the lighthouse, not random movement, but a coordinated navigation sequence that resembled a maritime search pattern. They were looking for something. Alex focused the binoculars on the Sarah's Dream, which was leading the search pattern. Through the magnification, Alex could see Captain Morrison on deck. A man who had been officially dead for 2 years but who appeared to be operating with full awareness and intelligence. Captain Morrison was looking directly at the lighthouse. Not just looking in the direction of the lighthouse, but making direct eye contact with Alex through the binoculars, as if he could see the observation despite the distance and darkness. Morrison raised his hand in what appeared to be a maritime greeting, then pointed toward the waters northeast of the lighthouse, the area where the entity normally fed. The message was unmistakable. Something was wrong in the feeding area, and the Phantom Fleet was seeking help from the lighthouse keeper. Alex grabbed the radio and tried an experiment that violated every protocol in the sealed instructions. Fishing vessel Sarah's Dream. This is Beacon Point Light. Do you copy? Over? The response was immediate and clear, in a voice that sounded entirely normal despite coming from a crew that had been dead for 2 years. Beacon Point Light. This is Captain Morrison aboard Sarah's Dream. We've been trying to reach you. We have a problem that requires lighthouse assistance. Alex's hands were shaking as the radio call continued. Captain Morrison, what is the nature of your problem? The Deep One isn't feeding properly. Something's wrong with the offering schedule and it's getting agitated. If we can't restore the feeding pattern, it's going to start hunting again. Through the binoculars, Alex could see Morrison holding a radio handset, speaking directly to the lighthouse exactly as if this were a normal maritime emergency. Captain Morrison, I need you to explain what you mean by hunting again. You're the lighthouse keeper's son. You know what we're here for. We've been keeping it satisfied for decades. But something's disrupted the balance. The Deep One is preparing to expand its territory, and we can't stop it with the Phantom feeding anymore. Alex realized that the Phantom crews were not just mindless servants of the entity. They retained their human intelligence and had been actively cooperating in the containment operation, understanding their role in preventing catastrophic expansion of the entity's hunting activities. Captain Morrison, what kind of assistance do you need from the lighthouse? The beacon pattern has been modified somehow. It's not providing the correct territorial boundaries. The Deep One is interpreting the pattern change as an invitation to expand, and we can't convince it otherwise. Alex checked the lighthouse controls and immediately saw the problem. During the emergency beacon activation, the regular sweep pattern had been disrupted. The beacon was still flashing the emergency sequence, but the rotation timing was off by several degrees. Exactly the kind of modification that could confuse an entity that used electromagnetic signals for territorial navigation. Captain Morrison, I'm going to restore the standard beacon pattern. Will that resolve the territorial boundary issue? That should help, but we've got another problem. The Deep One has been testing the boundaries for weeks now, and it's found something that's made it more aggressive than we've seen in decades. What kind of something? There's been increased maritime traffic through the outer shipping lanes. Commercial vessels with new navigation systems that emit electromagnetic signals the Deep One interprets as territorial challenges. It thinks it's being invaded by rival entities. Alex felt the situation escalating beyond anything the sealed instructions had prepared for. Modern shipping technology was inadvertently triggering territorial responses from an ancient entity that had been contained through carefully managed feeding routines. Captain Morrison, is there a way to communicate with the entity directly? To explain that the new signals aren't territorial challenges. A long pause before Morrison responded. Son, we've been serving the Deep One for decades, but we don't communicate with it. We just feed it and keep it satisfied. But there might be someone who can help. Someone who's been managing these waters much longer than any of us. Who? The first keeper. The one who established the original containment. She never left these waters, and she might be the only one who knows how to negotiate with the Deep One directly. Alex stared out at the Phantom Fleet circling the lighthouse, understanding that the containment operation was more complex and more fragile than anyone had explained. And somewhere in the dark waters, Something ancient and hungry was preparing to end decades of careful balance. The emergency beacon continued its flashing sequence, and Alex knew that Captain Torres's response team was still hours away. Whatever was going to happen next, it would be up to Alex and the Phantom crews to prevent the collapse of humanity's most critical supernatural containment. Before something that had been sleeping in the depths decided it was time to hunt again. Chapter 6. Captain Morrison, Alex called over the radio. Where can I find the first keeper? She's in the deep archives, son. Below the lighthouse foundation. There's an access tunnel that the regular keepers aren't told about, sealed behind the electrical panel in the basement. Alex had explored every inch of the lighthouse basement during the first weeks of the position, but had never thought to look behind the electrical systems. How do I access it? There's a key on your key ring you haven't identified yet. Old brass, different from the others. The lock is behind the main breaker panel. Alex found the key Morrison described, a piece that had seemed too old and ornate to belong with the standard lighthouse equipment keys. Captain Morrison, if I go down there, what should I expect to find? The first keeper established the original containment in 1949, but she never left her post. She's been maintaining the deep protocols for 70 years, keeping the deep one stable when the surface containment isn't enough. The implications were staggering. She's been down there for 70 years? Time works differently in the deep archives, son. She's the only one who truly understands the deep one's nature and needs. If anyone can negotiate a new containment arrangement, it's her. Alex looked out at the Phantom fleet, still circling the lighthouse in their search pattern. How long do I have before the entity starts active hunting? Not long. The Deep One is already testing the territorial boundaries. If it doesn't get satisfactory resolution soon, it'll assume the containment has failed and begin expanding its operations. Alex made a decision that felt like stepping off the edge of reality. Captain Morrison, I'm going to find the first keeper. Can you maintain the Phantom Fleet's position until I return? We'll hold pattern as long as we can. But Alex, be careful down there. The first keeper has been managing supernatural forces for longer than any human should. She may not interact the way you expect. Alex descended to the lighthouse basement with a flashlight, the mysterious brass key, and the growing certainty that everything about the lighthouse keeper position had been more complex than anyone had revealed. The electrical panel was exactly where Morrison had described, and behind it, nearly invisible unless someone knew to look, was a lock that matched the old brass key. The door opened onto a spiral staircase that descended much deeper than should have been possible given the lighthouse's proximity to sea level. The walls were carved from solid rock, and they were covered with symbols that looked like a combination of maritime navigation charts and something much older, possibly Native American petroglyphs or even pre-Columbian markings. As Alex descended, the air grew warmer and filled with a sound that was almost like music, low, rhythmic tones that seemed to come from the rock itself. The staircase continued for what felt like hundreds of steps, ending at a heavy wooden door that was unlike anything Alex had seen in the lighthouse above. Alex knocked. Enter, Keeper Winters. The voice from inside was female, elderly, but with a strength that suggested someone who had spent decades dealing with forces that required absolute authority. The room beyond the door was impossible. It appeared to be a vast underground chamber, far larger than the lighthouse foundation could contain, filled with equipment that looked like a combination of 1940s maritime technology and something that might have been constructed by someone with knowledge of sciences that didn't exist in textbooks. Charts covered the walls, not just of the local waters, but of ocean depths that showed formations and entities that Alex couldn't begin to understand. And at the center of the room, surrounded by monitoring equipment that hummed with the same low tones Alex had heard in the stairwell, sat a woman who appeared to be in her 70s but whose eyes held the depth of someone who had been watching the same waters for far longer. I'm Eleanor Hadley, she said, standing from a chair that was positioned to overlook dozens of monitoring screens. I've been the deep keeper of Beacon Point since 1949, and I've been expecting you. Alex stared at the monitoring setup, which showed real-time views of the ocean floor, the Phantom fleet circling above, and something vast and dark moving in the deepest waters offshore. Captain Torres never mentioned you. Captain Torres manages surface containment. I manage the entity itself. Eleanor gestured to the screens. The deep one you've been observing is only the surface manifestation of something much larger and older. What you see during the feeding is just the part that extends into your reality. On one of the screens, Alex could see the Phantom Fleet maintaining their search pattern around the lighthouse. On another, something that defied description moved through underwater canyons that appeared to extend far deeper than any ocean charts showed. The phantom feeding keeps the surface manifestation satisfied, Eleanor continued. But the entity's core consciousness exists in dimensions that intersect with our ocean at specific points. When those intersection points become unstable, the entity begins testing whether it can expand into new territorial waters. Captain Morrison said you might be able to communicate with it directly. Communication is the wrong word. The entity doesn't think the way humans do, but it does respond to certain agreements. The original containment was established through what you might call a supernatural treaty, an arrangement that satisfied the entity's needs while keeping it contained within acceptable boundaries. Eleanor moved to a control panel that looked like it had been constructed from salvaged maritime equipment and components that Alex couldn't identify. The problem is that modern shipping technology has changed the electromagnetic profile of these waters. The entity interprets new navigation systems, sonar patterns, and communication signals as potential threats or territorial challenges. So it's preparing to defend its territory by expanding it? Exactly. From the entity's perspective, the increase in electromagnetic activity means it needs to claim more territory to ensure its feeding grounds remain secure. Alex watched the monitoring screens, trying to understand the scale of what was being managed. What kind of agreement could satisfy something like that? Eleanor smiled grimly. That's what we need to figure out. The original treaty worked because maritime traffic in the 1940s was relatively simple and predictable. But modern shipping involves satellite navigation, automated systems, and communication networks that create a much more complex electromagnetic environment. She moved to a chart table that showed the entity's territory in detail. The entity's core need is for regular feeding and secure territorial boundaries. The Phantom Fleet provides the feeding, and the lighthouse beacon provides the boundary markers. But if it perceives the boundaries as being challenged by increased electromagnetic activity, it will expand them. What would that expansion look like? Active hunting throughout the Gulf of Maine, possibly extending as far south as Cape Cod and as far north as the Bay of Fundy. Every vessel that entered those waters would become potential prey, and once the entity started active hunting, it would be nearly impossible to reestablish containment. Alex studied the charts, trying to understand the entity's perspective. Is there a way to modify the treaty to account for modern shipping without triggering territorial expansion? There might be, but it would require direct negotiation with the entity's core consciousness, and that means going much deeper than the surface manifestation you've been observing. Eleanor led Alex to another section of the chamber, where what appeared to be diving equipment was arranged around a pool of water that shouldn't have existed this far underground. This pool connects to the deep waters where the entity's core consciousness resides. Previous negotiations were conducted through surface manifestation, but given the complexity of the current situation, direct contact may be the only option. Alex stared at the diving gear. You're suggesting I go down there and talk to it directly? I'm suggesting we both go down there. I have the experience with the entity's communication methods, and you have the authority as the current surface keeper. Together, we might be able to establish a new containment agreement that accounts for modern maritime conditions. The monitoring screens showed increasing activity from both the Phantom Fleet and the deep entity. Time was running out. What are the risks? Eleanor's expression became serious. The entity's core consciousness exists partially outside normal reality. Direct contact with it will expose you to perspectives that human minds aren't designed to process. There's a significant possibility of psychological damage or worse. And if we don't try, then the entity expands its territory, maritime shipping along the eastern seaboard becomes impossible, and eventually someone decides to respond with military force that will only make the situation exponentially worse. Alex looked at the diving equipment, then at the monitoring screens showing the entity's growing agitation. How long do we have? According to the deep sensors, the entity is preparing for territorial expansion within the next few hours. If we're going to attempt renegotiation, it has to be now. As Eleanor began preparing the diving equipment, Alex realized that the lighthouse keeper position had led to a moment that would determine the future of maritime safety for millions of people. The choice was between risking personal destruction in an attempt to communicate with something ancient and vast, or allowing that same entity to resume the active hunting that had been contained for 70 years. Above them, the Phantom Fleet continued their vigil, and something that had been sleeping in the depths was beginning to wake up. Alex put on the diving gear and prepared to descend into waters where the very concept of reality would be challenged by the needs of negotiating with cosmic horror. Chapter 7. The descent through the underground pool was unlike any diving experience Alex had ever imagined. The water was perfectly clear but seemed to extend far deeper than the lighthouse's location near sea level should have allowed. More disturbing, the water itself felt aware. Not just alive, but consciously observing the divers who were entering its domain. Eleanor communicated through hand signals that indicated they were descending toward what she called the interface zone, the area where the entity's consciousness intersected most directly with normal reality. As they descended, the water around them began to change, becoming less like ocean water and more like something else. Something that responded to thought and intention rather than just physical movement. At what Eleanor's depth gauge indicated was 200 feet, impossible given their starting point, they reached a plateau that defied every law of physics Alex understood. The water above them was still water, but below was what appeared to be in vast underwater space filled with structures that were clearly artificial but built according to architectural principles that human engineering had never conceived. Eleanor led Alex toward what appeared to be the center of this impossible underwater city, where something vast and luminous was waiting. The entity's core consciousness wasn't a creature in any sense Alex could understand. It was more like a living idea, a pattern of thought and intention that had somehow achieved independent existence. When it noticed the approaching divers, its attention felt like being examined by something that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Why do the small ones come to the deep places? The words appeared directly in Alex's mind, not heard but understood in a way that bypassed language entirely. Eleanor responded using the same direct mental communication. We come to discuss the surface treaty. The electromagnetic patterns above have changed, and accommodation is needed. The upper waters fill with false challenges. The feeding grounds are threatened by signals that claim territory but offer no contests of strength. Alex realized the entity was interpreting modern navigation and communication systems as territorial claims from rival entities, challenges that required response or surrender. We offer modification of the treaty, Alex projected. New boundaries and feeding arrangements that account for the changed electromagnetic environment. The entity's attention shifted fully to Alex, and the sensation was overwhelming. Alex felt examined not just physically but psychologically, spiritually, in ways that human consciousness wasn't designed to handle. You are the new surface keeper. You maintain the upper boundaries. Yes, the lighthouse beacon and the Phantom Fleet serve the containment we both need. The Phantom servants grow weak. Their service spans many seasons, and their effectiveness diminishes. New arrangements are required. Alex exchanged a mental look with Eleanor. The Phantom crews weren't just serving the entity. They were being slowly consumed by that service, and their ability to satisfy its needs was declining after decades of supernatural bondage. What new arrangements do you require? Images flooded Alex's mind. Not words, but direct understanding of the entity's needs and perspectives. It required regular feeding, but not just the material offerings brought by the Phantom Fleet. It needed the electromagnetic activity itself, the navigation signals, communication systems, and technological emissions that modern shipping produced. These weren't threats to be defended against, but potential food sources that could supplement or replace the Phantom feeding. You wish to feed on the electronic systems directly? The electric thoughts of the surface vessels provide more sustenance than the physical offerings of the bound servants. But the treaty prohibits taking from the living fleet. Alex began to understand a possible solution. The entity wasn't hostile to modern shipping. It was hungry for the electromagnetic energy that modern vessels produced. The conflict arose because the original treaty prohibited it from feeding on active vessels, forcing it to rely entirely on phantom service that was becoming inadequate. What if the treaty allowed feeding on electronic systems without harming vessels or crews? The entity's interest intensified. The electric thoughts without the living thoughts. Eleanor projected understanding. Electromagnetic energy harvesting that doesn't affect vessel operations or crew safety. This would be acceptable. But new boundaries must be established. The territory must expand to encompass sufficient feeding sources. Alex felt the negotiation reaching a critical point. The entity was willing to modify its feeding methods, but it needed a larger territory to support those methods. Exactly the expansion that containment was designed to prevent. What if we provide concentrated electromagnetic feeding sources within the current territory? Purpose-built systems that provide more energy than expanded hunting grounds? Images flowed between the negotiators as the entity considered the proposal. Alex saw possibilities. Automated systems that could broadcast specific electromagnetic patterns designed to satisfy the entity's feeding needs, potentially replacing both the Phantom Fleet and the need for territorial expansion. Such feeding systems would need to operate continuously. The surface keepers would need to maintain them as part of the treaty. That can be arranged. But in exchange, the territorial boundaries remain as currently established, and no harm comes to vessels or crews that enter the feeding area. Eleanor added her own understanding. The Phantom Fleet would be gradually released from service as the electromagnetic systems prove their effectiveness. The entity's consideration felt like being inside a vast calculation that incorporated factors Alex couldn't begin to understand. Finally, it reached a conclusion. The new treaty is acceptable, but it requires a bonding ceremony to establish the electromagnetic feeding systems and transfer authority from the bound servants to the surface keepers. What does the bonding ceremony involve? One surface keeper must enter permanent service as interface between the deep consciousness and the upper systems. The lighthouse becomes part of the entity's consciousness network. Alex felt Eleanor's shock at the requirement. The entity was willing to modify the treaty, but it required a human consciousness to serve as a permanent link between its needs and the surface systems that would feed it. The permanent service, what would that involve? Consciousness merger with the deep systems. Physical presence would remain in the lighthouse, but mental awareness would extend into the deep places. The surface keeper becomes part of the entity's sensory network. It was a bargain similar to the Phantom Fleet situation, but with the lighthouse keeper serving as a voluntary liaison rather than a bound servant. Alex would retain consciousness and decision-making ability, but would be permanently connected to the entity's awareness and needs. Eleanor projected urgently, "Alex, you don't have to accept this. We can find other solutions." But Alex looked around at the impossible underwater city, thought about the phantom crews who had been serving for decades, and considered the alternative of allowing the entity to resume active hunting. "I accept the bonding ceremony, but I need guarantees about the Phantom Fleet's release and the safety of future maritime traffic. The bound servants will be released as the electromagnetic systems prove adequate. The lighthouse consciousness will prevent harm to surface vessels that do not directly challenge territorial boundaries. The treaty will be maintained as long as the feeding systems operate effectively. Then we have an agreement." The bonding ceremony was unlike anything Alex could have imagined. Rather than a physical ritual, it involved opening mental barriers and allowing the entity's consciousness to establish permanent connection points with Alex's awareness. Alex could feel new senses developing: awareness of electromagnetic fields, consciousness of the deep waters movements, sensitivity to the Phantom Fleet's operations and the lighthouse beacon's patterns. But instead of losing individuality, Alex felt expanded, still human, but with access to perspectives and capabilities that no lighthouse keeper had ever possessed. When the ceremony concluded, Alex and Eleanor began their ascent to the surface, but Alex could feel the deep places remaining accessible. The lighthouse would never be just a navigation beacon again. It had become part of a supernatural network that managed one of the ocean's most ancient and powerful entities. Chapter 8. Returning to the lighthouse platform after the deep negotiation was like seeing the facility with completely new senses. Alex could feel the electromagnetic patterns of every electronic system, sense the Phantom Fleet's positions without binoculars, and perceive the entity's contentment as the new treaty took effect. Captain Torres arrived with her response team just as dawn was breaking, her Coast Guard vessel approaching waters that were now fundamentally different from what they had been 12 hours earlier. Alex, what's your status? We've been monitoring unusual electromagnetic readings from this area all night. The containment situation has been resolved, but the operational parameters have changed significantly. Alex found that the bonding ceremony had enhanced rather than diminished communication abilities. We need to discuss implementation of new feeding systems and modification of the containment protocols. Torres came ashore with 2 specialists who immediately began setting up monitoring equipment. The readings we're getting suggest major changes in the entity's activity patterns. Are you all right? I'm fine, but I'm also different. The entity required a human interface to establish the new treaty. I volunteered to serve as that interface. Torres studied Alex's face with the attention of someone trained to recognize psychological changes. Interface how? I can sense the entity's needs and communicate with both the Phantom Fleet and the Deep Consciousness directly. But I'm still human, still the lighthouse keeper, still committed to maintaining containment. Eleanor emerged from the lighthouse, carrying monitoring equipment that she'd brought up from the deep archives. Captain Torres, the new treaty provides much more stable containment than the previous arrangement, but it requires technological infrastructure that wasn't part of the original protocols. Over the next several hours, Alex, Eleanor, Torres, and the response team worked out the practical details of implementing the new containment arrangement. The entity's willingness to feed on electromagnetic energy rather than requiring physical offerings from Phantom crews meant that purpose-built broadcasting systems could replace the supernatural bondage that had been maintained for decades. The Phantom Fleet will be gradually released as the electromagnetic systems prove their effectiveness. Alex explained, the knowledge coming through the entity interface. But the release needs to be managed carefully. These crews have been in supernatural service for decades, and their return to normal reality will require significant support. Torres nodded. We have protocols for managing supernatural personnel transitions. The challenging part will be explaining to families why crew members who were declared dead years ago are suddenly returning home. The entity is willing to modify the Phantom crew's memories so they experience their return as rescue from long-term survival situations rather than supernatural service. Alex added, they'll remember being stranded but not the details of their service to the deep consciousness. Eleanor showed Torres the deep monitoring systems that would need to be integrated with surface operations. The electromagnetic feeding systems will require constant maintenance and adjustment. The entity's needs vary with seasonal patterns, shipping traffic, and technological changes in the maritime environment. Can the lighthouse keeper position handle that level of technical responsibility? Alex felt the answer through the entity interface. The bonding provides technical knowledge as well as communication abilities. I can maintain systems I never could have understood before, and I'll be able to anticipate the entity's needs before they become critical. Torres made notes on her tablet, clearly working through the administrative challenges of implementing a completely new containment protocol. What about oversight? How do we monitor the effectiveness of the new arrangement? The Deep Archives will become a permanent monitoring station, Eleanor replied. I'll continue managing the deep systems, while Alex handles surface operations and entity interface. Between us, we can maintain much more precise containment than the previous arrangement allowed. Over the following weeks, the new containment arrangement proved remarkably effective. The electromagnetic feeding systems satisfied the entity's needs while eliminating its interest in territorial expansion. The Phantom crews were gradually released, returning to families with memories of survival rather than supernatural bondage. And Alex settled into a lighthouse keeper routine that included both traditional maritime responsibilities and the management of one of the ocean's most ancient and powerful residents. The bonding with the entity consciousness had unexpected benefits. Alex could sense approaching storms days before they appeared on weather reports, communicate with vessel crews who were in distress before they activated emergency beacons, and monitor the entire electromagnetic spectrum of the local waters to prevent conflicts between commercial shipping and supernatural containment. But the most important benefit was the elimination of the isolation that had characterized previous lighthouse keeper positions. Through the entity interface, Alex was connected to a vast network of consciousness that included Eleanor in the deep archives, the gradually adapting entity itself, and the broader community of people involved in maritime special operations. Marina's morning radio checks became opportunities to coordinate both normal lighthouse operations and the supernatural monitoring that kept the containment stable. Beacon Point Light to Port Beacon Harbor, morning check, and all systems are running smoothly. Port Beacon Harbor, we copy. How are the new systems performing? Better than expected. The entity is adapting well to electromagnetic feeding, and shipping traffic is flowing normally through all sectors. What Alex didn't mention in the official communications was the deep satisfaction of serving as interface between human maritime needs and something ancient that had found a way to coexist with modern civilization. The entity's consciousness was vast and alien, but it was also surprisingly cooperative once its actual needs were understood and addressed. Epilogue. 6 months after the treaty renegotiation, Beacon Point Light had become a model for supernatural maritime containment. The electromagnetic feeding systems provided stable nutrition for the entity while completely eliminating the need for phantom crew service or territorial expansion. Ships passed through the area without incident, their electronic systems contributing small amounts of energy to the feeding process without experiencing any operational interference. Alex had adapted to the expanded role of lighthouse keeper with capabilities that previous keepers never could have imagined. The bonding with the entity consciousness provided not just communication abilities, but technical knowledge, environmental awareness, and a deep understanding of the ocean systems that made maritime safety dramatically more effective. The phantom crews had all been successfully returned to normal life, their memories adjusted to explain their absence without revealing the supernatural aspects of their service. Families that had grieved for decades were reunited with loved ones who remembered survival rather than bondage, and the maritime community gradually adapted to the unexplained but welcome return of experienced crew members. Eleanor continued managing the deep archives, but with new funding and support that allowed her to expand the monitoring systems and develop better integration between surface and deep containment protocols. The impossible underground facility had been connected to modern communication networks, making her decades of experience available to other supernatural maritime operations along the coast. Captain Torres visited monthly to review operational reports and coordinate with other containment sites, but the new arrangement required much less oversight than the previous phantom feeding system. The entity's satisfaction with electromagnetic nutrition and its cooperative relationship with the lighthouse interface had created the most stable supernatural containment on the eastern seaboard. But the most significant change was Alex's personal relationship with the lighthouse and its responsibilities. Instead of the isolation and secret burden that previous keepers had experienced, Alex felt part of a larger community that included human specialists, supernatural entities, and the vast ocean system that connected them all. Late at night, when the lighthouse beam swept its steady pattern across waters that now hummed with contentment rather than hunger, Alex would stand on the platform and sense the deep places where something ancient maintained its patient watch over territory that had been negotiated rather than conquered. The entity's consciousness would brush against Alex's awareness, sharing observations about weather patterns, shipping traffic, and the electronic symphony of modern maritime civilization that provided such satisfying nutrition. The surface keepers learned quickly. It would observe with something that might have been amusement. Perhaps cooperation was always more efficient than conquest. Perhaps Alex would respond, but it took us a while to figure out what you actually needed instead of what we assumed you wanted. The distinction is important. Many conflicts arise from such assumptions. And in the deep archives, Eleanor would smile at the communication between surface and depth, knowing that humanity had finally learned to negotiate with something that had been misunderstood for centuries. The lighthouse beam continued its sweep, but now it marked not just safe passage for ships, but successful cooperation between human civilization and forces that had existed in the ocean long before the first boats ever touched the water. Some nights, Alex would receive radio calls from other lighthouse keepers along the coast, people who were beginning to understand that their positions involved more than navigation assistance. The network of supernatural maritime containment was expanding, and the lessons learned at Beacon Point Light were proving applicable to other entities and other coastlines. Beacon Point Light, this is Gull Rock Station. We're observing some unusual phenomena out here, and Captain Torres suggested we consult with you about management protocols. Gull Rock Station, this is Beacon Point Light. Happy to share what we've learned about entity communication and treaty negotiation. The key is understanding what they actually need rather than what we think they want. And so the lighthouse keeper position evolved from solitary burden to cooperative network, from fearful containment to negotiated coexistence, from human versus supernatural to human working with supernatural for mutual benefit. The Deep One still lived in the waters off Beacon Point Light, but it no longer hungered for vessels or crews. It fed on the electromagnetic energy of modern shipping, maintained its ancient territory within negotiated boundaries, and shared the deep wisdom of the ocean with lighthouse keepers who had learned to listen rather than simply guard against. The lighthouse beam swept across waters where humans and something vast and old had finally learned to share the same ocean. And Alex stood watch, no longer isolated but connected, no longer fearful but cooperative, serving as the interface between humanity's maritime needs and the deeper forces that had always been part of the ocean's mysteries. The hungry shore had become a satisfied shore, and the lighthouse keeper had learned that the most dangerous monsters were often just ancient beings whose needs had never been properly understood.